two massive pythons coiled tightly around a mute girl in the frigid wilderness of Alaska. It seemed like the end. But then, from the shadows of the deep forest, a towering figure emerged. It made no roar, no sound at all. It wasn't human. It wasn't a hunter. It was a brown bear. But instead of attacking, it stepped calmly toward the girl, facing down the pythons. Why would a wild brown bear do that? Why protect a human instead of attacking one? Watch closely, because what happens next will freeze the entire forest in stunned silence. That morning, Mira Lin left the house before the sun had fully touched the mountains behind town. In her small backpack were a sketchbook, a watercolor set, a bottle of filtered water, and a single red apple. She packed them with care, as if preparing for a quiet ritual with nature. Every spring morning in Alaska, brief as the season was, Mira followed this routine. She didn't need words to explain it. It was simply how she connected with the world. Mira was 16, mute since birth. Though she could hear everything around her, no words had ever left her lips. To strangers, her silence often brought pity or distance. But for Mira, silence was simply the way things were. It needed no explanation. After a half-hour walk, she reached a wide clearing with a moss-covered boulder, her usual spot to paint. Morning light filtered through the trees, casting shifting bands of color across the ground. Mira sat beside the stone, carefully laying out her tools in the same order each time. Sketchbook on the left, watercolors on the right, apple in front. Everything in its place, like a ceremony. No voices, no interruptions, just her and the world she was trying to capture. She began to draw. Her hand moved steadily, eyes locked on how the sunlight flickered through the leaves, glinting off the forest floor like shards of glass. Brush stroke by brush stroke, translucent layers of paint formed a gentle sky. The scene wasn't complex, but it was honest. It felt real. As if the paper wasn't just showing the landscape, but something from deep inside her. Mira tilted her head, watching a squirrel dart along a branch in the distance. She leaned forward, lifting her brush to capture its movement in the corner of her sketch. But just as her hand rose, something made her stop. The birds had gone quiet. The wind had stilled. There was no sound at all, just a thick, unnatural silence. A chill ran down her spine. Slowly, Mira turned her head. Just a few yards behind her, a thick python was slithering silently across the bed of dried leaves. Its mottled, glistening skin caught the faint morning light, shimmering with a sickly sheen. It made no sound, but its movement seemed to compress the air around it, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And it wasn't alone. From the opposite direction, another python emerged, both creatures slowly closing in on her. Mira sprang to her feet, clutching her sketchbook. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but her throat couldn't do that. All she could do was back away, step by trembling step, her eyes wide with terror as the two serpents picked up speed. The faster one struck first, launching forward and coiling itself around her legs. She crashed to the damp forest floor. Cold seeped into her skin, from the earth and from the snake's tightening grip. The second python slithered around her waist, constricting with methodical pressure. Mira thrashed, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. Her skin turned pale and blue beneath the crushing force. She writhed, nails breaking and bleeding as they scraped the dirt. Her legs kicked wildly, desperately, but the snakes didn't relent. No sound escaped her lips. She couldn't scream, couldn't call out, couldn't warn anyone. All she had were her eyes, wide, panicked, searching the woods for some impossible salvation. The first python reached her chest, each tightening coil squeezing the breath from her lungs. The second reared back, then sank its teeth into her left shoulder. The bite wasn't deep, but blood trickled through the sleeve of her down jacket. Mira's body began to fail. Her struggles grew feeble. Her vision blurred. Her thoughts scattered like dry leaves in wind. Life wasn't leaving her with a scream, but with each lost breath, each broken heartbeat. Just slightly. It wasn't the snakes. It wasn't the wind. Something heavier, something larger, was approaching. Through the haze of fading consciousness, Mira caught a glimpse of a dark shape, moving through the last slivers of light filtering down between the trees. A towering shadow stepped into view, slow and steady, a full-grown brown bear. It stood still for a few seconds, surveying the scene. There was no rage in its eyes, no madness, just clarity, amber eyes calm and sharp, holding something that looked almost like recognition. It didn't roar like a predator, didn't stalk like a hunter. It didn't hesitate. The bear lunged. Its massive body cut through the air with such force that the pythons froze. Before the larger snake could react, the bear's paw came crashing down. One brutal swipe flung the snake backward, its long body flipping through the air before slamming to the ground with a sickening thud. Something snapped, but the bear wasn't finished. It turned on the second snake, jaws wide, and sank its teeth deep into the middle of its coiled body. With a violent shake, muscle and scales tore apart. The reptiles writhed and recoiled, dragging their bloodied bodies across the forest floor in retreat. Mira didn't see the end of the fight. The moment the bear appeared, her fading consciousness gave way to darkness. But just before everything went black, she saw one last thing: the bear's eyes. Not the eyes of a wild beast, but the eyes of a creature that had once known pain, true, deep loss, and refused to let it happen again. Then the darkness swallowed her, and the forest returned to silence. But this silence was different. This time it had been earned, with blood, and with an act no one could have foreseen. When Mira opened her eyes, the sky had turned a deep orange. The sun was barely a thin streak of light behind the trees. The air was cooler now, but the earth beneath her still carried the sharp scent of blood. She pushed herself up, hands trembling, needing several minutes to gather her bearings. Her clothes were torn and stained. Bruises ringed her waist and thighs where the snakes had coiled, but she was alive. Pages from her sketchbook were scattered around the mossy rock. Her apple was crushed. Where she had fallen, blood still marked the ground, and beside it, unmistakable prints. Bear tracks. Next to them, a few strands of brown fur clung to a broken branch. Mira looked around. No sign of the snakes. No sign of the bear. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. But in her eyes now was something unfamiliar, a flood of emotions, tangled together, fear, awe, and gratitude. She didn't go to the hospital. She didn't go to the police. She didn't tell a single soul what had happened. Because even if she could speak, no words would ever be enough to explain what took place that day. When she got home, her grandmother froze at the sight of Mira, bruised, dirty, shaken. But Mira simply wrapped her arms around the old woman and didn't let go. That night, she didn't eat. She didn't sleep. But she didn't panic either. Instead, she sat silently at her desk, pulled out a fresh sketchbook, and began to draw. Page after page. She drew the shadowed woods, the haze of early morning mist. She drew coils of black snakes wrapping around a small human figure. She drew the eyes, desperate, pleading, and then, in the center of it all, she drew the bear. The most powerful piece came 2 days later. A girl lay on the forest floor, her body tangled in thick, dark serpent coils. In front of her stood a brown bear, rising to its full height, staring down the threat with fierce, unwavering eyes. Behind the bear, the snakes were retreating, not slain, but pushed back, as if something far stronger than brute force was holding them at bay. The emotion wasn't fear, it was protection. And Mira conveyed that through color, through trembling yet deliberate strokes of her brush. Her grandmother showed the drawing to a local artist, an old friend who curated small exhibitions at the town library. She shared it simply out of awe. No one expected what happened next. Once the image hit social media, it went viral within hours. A popular art account reposted it with the caption, "She didn't need to speak. Her painting screamed for her." Most viewers didn't know who Mira was or what she'd survived, but they felt something undeniable, a deep, unspoken emotion present in the bear's eyes, in the fragile figure surrounded by darkness, in the thick strokes where light pierced the forest canopy. Parents sent thank you messages. Children drew their own versions of the bear. Someone gave the painting a name, When Silence Roars. An animal rights group reached out, asking to use the artwork as the symbol for a new campaign about the bond between humans and nature. Mira still said nothing. But for the first time, the world began to listen, not through words, but through the silence she had poured onto the page. And even after everything that happened, Mira kept returning to the forest. Not out of curiosity, not to relive what she'd endured, but because she felt, deep down, that the forest wasn't finished with her yet. A week after her painting swept across social media, Mira quietly packed a small bag. This time, there was no sketchbook inside, just 2 things. A single red apple and 1 laminated drawing. It wasn't like the others. There were no snakes, no forest floor, just the face of the bear and Mira's eyes, locked in a silent gaze. No action, only recognition, a brief but profound moment that said more than anything she'd ever known. She walked back to the forest, the same path that had once been stained with blood. Most of the signs were gone now. New leaves had fallen, spring wind had swept away the remnants. But the boulder, the one where she had nearly lost her life, remained. Still, quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. She knelt, pulled out the drawing and propped it against the rock with a small stone. Then she placed the apple beside it. No note, no name. No explanation. Just a silent, heartfelt thank you to the creature who didn't leave her behind. Mira rose to her feet, cast one last look around, not in hope, not in fear, but with deep, quiet gratitude, then walked away. A week later, she returned. The trail was the same, the boulder unmoved, but the drawing was gone. Her heart raced for reasons she couldn't name. She stepped closer. At the base of the rock, faint claw marks, 3 thin grooves, scratched lightly into the damp earth. Beside them, the apple had been bitten. A single chunk missing, teeth marks large and unmistakably unrodent-like. No sound, no message. But those tiny details spoke more than any words could. The bear had come back, and it had seen. It hadn't destroyed the drawing, hadn't trampled it, just taken it, like someone keeping something precious. Mira sat in the grass before the stone, for once without her sketchbook. She didn't need to draw it. This moment was already etched into her memory. Between her and the bear, there had never been words, but there had been understanding. And sometimes that was stronger than speech. She left the forest with a weight lifted from her heart. From that day on, Mira kept painting. Not for the internet. Not for fame. But because she finally understood. Some things can't be said aloud, but they can still reach someone's heart, even if that heart doesn't beat in a human chest. The story of Mira and the brown bear stirred her small Alaskan town for weeks. To many, it was a miracle of the wild, a meeting that defied logic and explanation. But for scientists and wildlife experts, it raised a deeper question. Why would a brown bear risk everything to protect a human? The question sparked a quiet investigation, one that began in the very forest where Mira had nearly died. Dr. Elliot Rains, a seasoned biologist at the Alaska Wildlife Research Institute, was the first to examine the event through a scientific lens. With more than 2 decades studying bear behavior across North America, especially brown bears, often labeled as territorial, aggressive, and unpredictable, Elliot found Mira's encounter entirely outside the norm. He began reviewing footage from a network of motion-activated wildlife cameras his team had installed throughout the forest. These cameras, triggered by body heat, recorded any significant movement within their range. 10 days before the python attack, Elliot found something remarkable. A series of videos showing a full-grown brown bear frequenting the very part of the woods Mira visited. But it wasn't just the bear's presence that stopped him cold. It was what he saw in the footage from 4 mornings before the attack. The bear wasn't alone. Lumbering alongside her was a cub, just a few months old, its steps still uncertain. The mother bear constantly glanced back to check on it, pausing now and then to let the little one catch up. Each glance, each hesitation, a clear, instinctive display of maternal care. But in the footage from the next evening, something changed. There was a loud crack, branches breaking, a deep, guttural roar filled with anguish. The camera caught the mother bear pacing in circles in a narrow clearing, emitting shrill, distressed cries. Not the threatening roar of a predator, but the grief-stricken wails of a mother. Elliot slowed the footage. On the ground, bloodstains. A tuft of soft cub fur caught in a bush, but no cub in sight, and then, in the corner of the frame, just for a second, a shadow gliding through the underbrush, the unmistakable shape of a large python. No one had considered the possibility that a cub, nimble, fast, could become prey. But if the snake struck from a branch, or ambushed from beneath the leaves, and if the cub had wandered just a few feet too far, it was more than plausible. Elliot sat in silence, connecting the dots. A mother bear had lost her cub to a python, mere hundreds of yards from where Mira would later be attacked. She didn't leave. She lingered, circled the area, roared into the empty trees, marked her presence. And days later, when another small, helpless creature, this time not a cub, not even a wild animal, was caught in those same coils, the bear stepped in. Elliot replayed the footage of Mira unconscious, rescued. He had seen countless animal instincts, territorial rage, survival-driven aggression, even moments of playfulness. But this was something else. The bear didn't attack for territory. It didn't feed on the snake it defeated. And it didn't harm Mira, though she was motionless and defenseless. It did only one thing. It stood between shadow and light, between death and survival, between past and present. Elliot shared his findings with a local media team. Using clips from the forest cameras, they edited a short video, footage of the bear and her cub, the eerie night cries, the snake's lurking presence, and finally, the day Mira was attacked. The video was just 3 minutes long, but when paired with Mira's painting, the one of the bear standing guard before her, it became something more, a tidal wave of feeling. Summer passed gently, and the Alaskan forest shifted into autumn, its trails blanketed in gold and crimson leaves. Mira still visited the woods, but she no longer moved like someone hiding. Each step she took seemed lighter, as though something unseen had lifted her spirit and carried part of her pain away. After everything, Mira decided to do one last thing, not to remember, but to give thanks. Over several quiet days, she carefully carved a small statue from cedar wood. It was no taller than her knee, but the details were clear. On one side, a large bare paw, claws short and curved gently downward, as if mid-step. On the other side, a tiny girl stood with her arm raised, not touching the bear, but close enough to feel the connection. The girl's wooden face had no mouth, only wide, deeply carved eyes, gazing into the distance. On an early winter morning, with the season's first snow drifting softly onto the treetops, Mira cradled the statue in her arms and returned to that forest. The air was sharp, the forest floor beginning to freeze beneath the decaying leaves, but she walked without hesitation, in silence. She reached the rock, the very place that once marked the line between life and death. Mira placed the statue there, exactly where she had once fallen. No plaque, no message. She simply left it facing the woods, as if to say, "I'm still here, and I remember." Then she stepped back, bowed deeply, and left without looking behind. Time moved on. Winter came colder and faster than anyone expected. Snow blanketed the forest, trails vanished, sounds disappeared beneath the thick crust of ice. People stopped talking about Mira and about the bear, but Mira's grandmother still saw her each day, sitting quietly at her desk, drawing. The paintings were different now. No more coils of snakes, no more wide, terrified eyes. Instead, snowy trees, a bear curled beneath roots, an owl perched on a bare branch, and a girl, sometimes painting, sometimes just standing still under the canopy, smiling, even though she had no mouth. Mira no longer shared her drawings. She didn't post them, didn't send them to local artists. She kept them for herself. Because now, painting wasn't a cry for help. It was a whisper for anyone who knew how to listen. In this world, it isn't always words that create connection. Sometimes it's a glance, a brush stroke, or a simple wooden carving. And in those quiet gestures, one heart reaches another, across species, across all boundaries.